Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2026 Human Rights Education Review webinar series. Human Rights Education Review, or HRER, is an award-winning peer-reviewed scholarly journal founded in 2018. And it's currently published by Taylor and Francis. And we'd like you to know that we welcome submissions that address human rights education at all levels of schooling, from early years through to higher education, as well as those um, contributions that are exploring human rights concerns in informal education. This webinar series is hosted in cooperation with International Association for Human Rights Education, IAHRE, and is the flagship journal of IAHRE. Webinars are based on recently published articles from the journal, and we're very grateful to the association for its support. IAHRE was established in 2023 and exists to promote human rights education globally, to further research in human rights education, and to enrich networking among human rights education scholars, as well as cooperation between researchers and those who are working in NGOs and intergovernmental organizations. We hold an annual conference, which in 2026 will be held in Munster in just a few days' time in Germany from the 26th to the 27th of May. You can find out more about IAHRE activities on the association's website, and we'll put a link in for you. And we also invite those of you who are not members to consider joining or supporting the organization. Thank you. So it's my great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Carmel Ward as our speaker. Carmel holds a PhD from Queen's University Belfast, and her talk today is going to be drawing on a paper which she presented, which is also part of her doctoral research, which explored young children's understandings of human rights education. The paper is set in Rwanda, and I know that Carmel lived in Rwanda for some 6 years. She's not just a researcher, she's also a very, very experienced educator. Carmel is a teacher, a head teacher, and she's a specialist leader in early childhood education. We spent some years as a head teacher at a nursery school and a children's centre in Birmingham, UK. She's also worked with UNICEF in Ireland and the UK, offering guidance on children's rights in education. And her particular interest is in the rights of marginalised children. So we welcome Carmel today, and she's going to be looking at recontextualising young children's human rights in Rwanda. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Thanks for the introduction and for inviting me. And hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. So as Audrey said, during this webinar, I'm going to be presenting elements of my paper that was published in the Human Rights Education Review Journal. It's all about recontextualising young children's human rights education in Rwanda. As Audrey said, I spent almost 6 years living in Rwanda, and this photograph on the front of the presentation actually reminds me of the warmth and the beauty of the country and the people. But we'll come back to Rwanda in a moment. First, for those of you who might be less familiar with human rights education, I'm going to give you a very quick overview of it and a pointer to the rationale for my research. So on the next slide, if Beata's taken control of my slides, because we've both had technical issues. So this is a very quick and very simple overview. Human rights education can be defined as education about, through, and for rights. It is enshrined in the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child under Article 11, and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child under Article 29. Human rights education in early childhood should be interpreted in ways that are appropriate to local circumstances and respect traditional views. However, human rights education in early childhood has been overlooked in both research and practice guidance. And often cultural values are seen or portrayed as in conflict with rights. You might notice that the citations and the definitions here are all or mostly drawn from UN definitions. And that's because I'm going to be looking at a post-colonial theory later on. And I just wanted to highlight I suppose, the dominance really of the UN in the understanding some aspects of human rights education. So we're going to move on now to locating the study. My study is a participatory study based in Rwanda, which again we're going to come to in a moment. It explored young children's, their parents and teachers' perceptions of children's human rights education. Audrey described my background, which I think is really important to understand my position and my positionality, really. And actually, my interest stemmed from experiences and wondering why some teachers are strong advocates or defenders of children's rights, and others are quite hesitant for children to learn about rights. And also at the same time, I really was interested in understanding children's understanding of rights, because it's often assumed that very young children in their early childhood years, which is under 8 according to the UN, but under 6 often in the school system, because often it's assumed that rights are too abstract or too contentious for very young children. So as you can see from the beautiful photograph, the nursery school, the study was taken in Kigali, so that's the capital city of Rwanda. It was located in one nursery school and took place between 2020 and 2021. I won't go into details about it, but it was disrupted by the COVID pandemic. For those of you who don't know Rwanda, it's a very small and landlocked country in East Africa. I think it's particularly relevant to the paper to point out that Rwanda was colonised, originally by Germany and then by Belgium from 1919 to 1962. That's when Rwanda gained independence. And a post-colonial period, together with the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, followed. It's actually currently Kwibuka. And my Kinyarwanda pronunciation may not be quite right, but that means remember in Kinyarwanda. It's the annual commemoration period that lasts for 100 days between April the 7th and July. So this is a time for remembrance and a timely reminder, I think, given the state of children's rights across the world, a reminder to the world that the motto is never again. I think it's also important to explain why I choose not to write too much about Rwanda's history when in my work. And that's because, again, taking a post-colonial lens, which we're going to talk about a little bit later again, Western authors like myself have extensively told or retold historical accounts of Rwanda. And this can reflect post-colonial and anti-colonial and decolonial concerns around epistemic authority and othering, and the marginalisation of Rwandan perspectives. And given that I'm not a historian and my research was very focused on experiences of children, their parents and teachers, in reality, it doesn't feel quite right, it doesn't sit quite comfortably with me. However, having said that, I do think it's important to acknowledge that I do recognise the colonial and post-conflict legacies that remain. But again, it's also important to acknowledge that people may not wish to be solely defined by these. So just it is very briefly, I suppose, it might be helpful to know that my work does, when it talks about colonial legacies, it is referring to the genocide. So just to finish off, just a little bit about Rwanda's education. There is a foundation, actually, of children's human rights education present in Rwanda's pre-primary curriculum. That's for children aged 3 to 6 years, which identifies respecting human rights as a competency that should be developed through rights-based approaches. I'm sure people in other parts of the world might recognise the language in that. So it's explicit to a sense, but not very detailed. While most nursery schools in Rwanda are private, the school where I carried out the research served a middle-income demographic. So this makes it a particular microcosm and contributes to showing, I suppose, plural experiences and perspectives that exist across Rwanda. I chose the nursery because of my pre-existing working relationship, and because the focus, as I said, was on engagement with children, their parents, and teachers who had actually experienced or encountered children's human rights education. So the participants, who I need to always extend my thanks to because this wouldn't have happened without them, included 38 children aged 3 to 6, 10 of whom we called research influencers, and that's because they were a core group and their roles fluctuated between being participants, quite active participants, and co-researchers. So the term research influencers is a nod to the Lundy model of participation. The other participants were those core group of 10 research influencers, their parents, and 12 of their teachers. So my research explored how insights into that group of children, parents and teachers' perspectives could contribute to renegotiating children's human rights education so that it's more meaningful for the children themselves and their community. So why I think this paper in particular and the research is quite novel is because I did use postcolonial theory, and I think it had a powerful impact on the way I worked with participants and the way my findings developed and were constructed through the process. So when I first met postcolonial theory, I did try to explain it to my supervisors, including Laura Lundy and Brona Barn, who were absolutely horrified by what I produced, because it's quite a complex and dense theory. And it's multifaceted. So I'm trying to give a very simple overview. So I hope I could do it justice, and I hope I explain it as well as possible in a short space of time. So I think you may all be familiar that postcolonial refers to a location or a time. But postcolonial theory designates what I like to see as a critical theory of hope. It transcends those historical and geographical boundaries to disrupt epistemic hierarchies and seek social transformation. So I chose postcolonial theory primarily because of the positionality of myself. So Audrey's given some details about that, so I won't go back over it. At the time of the research, I was a temporary resident in Rwanda, but a citizen of a colonising country, so the UK. And that's where I grew up, and that's where I became a teacher. So that's where a lot of my own knowledge came from. So I chose it specifically to help me address the ethical implications of working through the layers of colonial legacies in not only Rwanda, a post-colonial location, but also the discipline of children's rights itself. It did become a journey of self-discovery about my own fused colonial and colonised self-identities, which I won't go into now, but I'm based in Ireland, having Irish parents. So yeah, I spent some time reflecting on that and what that meant for myself. And it certainly, which I think is really, really important, challenged my own Eurocentric and Western assumptions. So this wasn't just about challenging existing writing and what I was reading. It was about challenging my own assumptions and beliefs, specifically because of where I come from, or where my knowledge comes from, and also because I am quite a strong children's human rights advocate myself. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you 4 core concepts that were gleaned from postcolonial scholarship to create my theoretical and my conceptual frameworks. And these are reconstructing knowledge, representation, resistance, and renegotiation. So postcolonial theory really questions how knowledge is produced and challenges inferior representations of others. I think seminal African postcolonial scholars in particular promote the deconstruction and reconstruction of knowledge within and about Africa to redress power imbalances. So I use the concept of reconstructing knowledges to unsettling the privileging of Western epistemologies and thinking, and to turn the focus towards existing knowledges within particularly the participants that I was working with, but also across my reading and my literature and my analysis. The concept of representation sought to avoid othering, so the othering of participants, and that included seeing divergence from dominant discourses like the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child could be considered a dominant discourse in children's rights. So rather than seeing divergence from maybe beliefs around that as a deficit, it really pushed me to think about valuing multiple ways of knowing. So post-colonial concerns that human rights are seen as a Eurocentric universal construct have led to calls for the recontextualisation of human rights education, which involves, I think, incorporating Indigenous wisdom and dialogue with learners and communities who will engage with it. So given that's the premise of the idea that my research was based on, the concepts of resistance and renegotiation became really, really important. So resistance really recognises the power imbalances in knowledge production. And I think it pushed me to consider actually respecting acts of resistance that might appear in conversations and interactions with participants. And then renegotiation evoked an exploration of plural perspectives and negotiations that actually could create new ways of thinking about human rights education, rather than just reaffirming knowledge from my own perspective or a Eurocentric perspective. I think post-colonial theory is relevant to the study, but it's very rarely been applied in the field of early childhood, particularly in research with children. So I also added to this framework by drawing on New Zealand's early childhood framework and incorporated something called working theories that I won't go into in detail. You can read about it in my papers, but I think it really helped me to apply post-colonial theory in practice with young children. So together, these ideas, so that meant that post-colonial theory and the concept of what I called working knowledges really activated this in-between space where resistance and opportunities for renegotiations could actually occur during the research. I'm going to move on. I tried to time myself with post-colonial theory and reduce it, but it's very difficult to capture in a very short space of time. So I am not going to do the methodology and methods justice. I'm going to whiz through the methods across the research, including with teachers and parents, involve talking circles, which were rooted in relational post-colonial Indigenous worldviews. This included 41 interest-inspired activity-based talking circles with children that integrated observations to obviously capture their multiple ways of expressing themselves. In addition, 4 of the research influencers conducted talking circles with 25 of their peers. So moving on, it was a very messy and unpredictable process, even though it was very, very well planned. But I think it provided rich and meaningful data. So the findings I'm going to focus on today are the findings based on the children's perspectives. However, I think it's important to explain that the emphasis on culture in the paper, in my research, stemmed directly from the findings across all participants. So an excerpt from my paper says, while children and parents and teachers shared experiences, it's really important, I think, to recognise the coexistence of plural and fluid, so dynamic working knowledges about children's human rights education existed. However, social cultural values were interwoven throughout the findings, illuminating the nuanced ways in which they shaped participants' perspectives. So the findings, I think, highlight children's relational ways of being and working knowledges. Children appear to understand rights as relational, as collective, and there was an emotional dimension. So they were emotive or emotional. This is a picture of Chase's happy heart, which I think really conveys the strong emotions that children attached to rights throughout the research. On this slide, there are also examples of children's work in knowledges, and you might notice that children often used collective pronouns such as we, I've highlighted them, and us, when recalling and defining rights. Latently, the children's work in knowledges were imbued, I think, with respect and compassion for others' rights. That was evident in their reciprocal emotions and their reactive emotions that they expressed when they looked at the peers' data and they imagined that their friends' rights were violated. This elicited feelings such as sadness, disappointment, and anger. The research influencers defined what defending rights meant, and they also expressed a desire to defend rights as they were doing that. Their definitions included aiming to make people happy and equal, aiming to protect people. Elsa expressed the right to protect your friends, and Anna stated, I want to fight for the rights of others. So the children's definitions really emphasise protection. They emphasise the helpful nature of rights and compassion for others. And their ideas were expressed as relational and reciprocal, reinforcing, I think, the importance of relationships and also a collective sense of responsibilities that I think came really strongly through the data. So on the next slide, we're going to look at a little bit more at how interwoven social cultural values were threaded through children's theories. And I'm going to go very quickly through this. You can perhaps see there's a woven thread of both legal and tacit knowledges that are shaped by social cultural worlds. The children had been learning about legal rights in school as part of their children's human rights education. Although the children involved will have experienced that to different degrees, partly because of their age range, but partly because of when they would have started school. But nonetheless, the children's theories, I think, reflect the dynamic and distinct Rwandan philosophy known as HRER, and that embodies the protection of human dignity and self-empowerment. Interestingly, at the same time, their theories also reflect goals of transformative forms of human rights education. Their understandings and definitions convey a sense of Ubuntu, which very briefly, it's a humanist philosophy that you may be familiar with Ubuntu. And this is the Rwandan philosophy it's equivalent but slightly different. It emphasizes interconnectedness, solidarity, compassion for others, for their well-being and dignity. So while theorizing rights, relational, traditional, social cultural values became visible. So the values of respect, reciprocity, and responsibility are central to fostering group solidarity or Ubuntu. And they came through quite strongly. And of course, I do need to recognize that in African cultures, like all cultures, they are dynamic and they change. But according to Nsamanang, who's passed away, but is a very respected scholar, and Chombe, responsibilities and responsibilization in Rwanda is very strong. And this became apparent in the findings. So I think we can move on to the next slide. I was going to talk very quickly about how at the beginning of the research, some of the children conflated what we might see as responsibilities and rights, such as cleaning the room and washing our hands. And when the research influence came together to look at the data to analyze it, they agreed that those were responsibilities, but they had a bit more of a mixed reaction when it came to being kind. There was some of the children thought being kind was a right. Some of the children thought being kind was a responsibility, and some children thought it was both. These are quite different findings to others, where children's conflations of rights and responsibilities are seen as being taught and linked to promoting positive behaviour or ideas about obedience and discipline. But if we look at children's resistant theories a little bit more, so taking the idea of a right to be kind, many children expressed a right to love, and you can see that in the pictures, and there's lots of hearts. So when we first started talking about rights, lots of children recalled the rights they knew and included the right to love. There were some children that insisted on a right to be kind, and again in the photograph that you can see, the older children looked and reviewed two of the articles in the African Charter on the rights and welfare of the child, the aims of education and the duties of the child, and suggested changes, which are noted on the butterflies. And Anna wrote kind on a butterfly to indicate a change. But she linked it with the words tolerance and friendship, which is interesting. And Siezra wrote kind on Article 31, which sets out children's duties, implying an interconnectedness with respect and responsibilities. So the children had very different views, but there were also some similarities across them. But if we look very close, I think this is really important. Children expressed the right to love with conviction and embodied emotion. And when I gently pointed out there was no legal entitlement to the right to love, my prompts were rejected outright. All the research influencers reaffirmed their belief, expressing that they would feel sad if it were taken away, which highlighted their emotional significance. Now, for people that work with young children, when children talk about feeling sad, it's quite profound, even though to us it might sound quite a simplistic way to describe a feeling. So I think it's important to think about that. I find this interesting for two reasons, because often we talk about children learning about rights and the accuracy that's needed for legal rights. And I think this just makes us think about how we might work with young children when their understandings or interpretations might be different. And that's because they're shaped by the social cultural values that surround them. So from a post-colonial perspective, I looked at these findings and thought this perhaps shouldn't be viewed as a misunderstanding to be corrected or dismissed at this point in their education. Rather, it can be viewed as an act of resistance against new legal knowledge that I was suggesting that conflicted with concepts that had been developed and shaped by their social cultural worlds. Like the concept of living rights, these findings, I think, illustrate how children were negotiating their interpretations of rights and defending their interpretations through these meaning-making processes. Overall, I think the findings, we're going to conclude now. I'm sorry if I've talked a little bit too much, I always do. Overall, I think the findings illustrate how children combine legal and existing tacit knowledge that has been shaped by their relational ontologies and social cultural experiences, their relationships, their emotions, and their values. Ultimately, the study points to new ways of thinking about children's human rights education in early childhood that interweaves rather than overlooks or displaces their existing knowledge systems. Arguably, I think questioning the contextual relevance of children's human rights education can actually promote respect for existing knowledges and social cultural values, and at the same time, respect for children and their legal rights. So I'm hoping that the paper challenges one-directional knowledge production about Rwanda and dominant portrayals of African culture in conflict with children's rights. I also hope that it shows that young children are capable of learning about, through, and for rights, and human rights education in early childhood is possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Carmel. We're going